This conference will now be recorded.
This conference is now being recorded. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening to Ed. Rick Stockton is going to talk to us today about the #1 reason your design will fail. But first, we have a new player on our call today. Rigoberto is in Mexico. And Rigoberto, why don't you introduce yourself to folks?
Hi, how are you? I'm an industrial designer. I have a design and engineering firm here in Puebla. It's near Mexico City. We've been doing design for several industries for the past 20 years now. And I'm very interested in medical design and medical devices because we have been working with some small and medium enterprises here in Mexico, helping them with the industrial design phase of the process. We work a lot with engineering design teams, and we support them with our capacity of design and user-centered design. That's what we are doing right now.
Bienvenido. Thanks for joining us today. John Richard Stockton, the screen is yours.
Okay. Well, most of you know me, but oh, I'm sorry. Am I making an echo? No, okay, just good. Most of you know me. My name is Rick Stockton. If you can endure about 1 minute and 20 seconds, just to introduce myself a little more. I design medical products. Husband of 1 gal and father of 3 young women. I'm a member of this program, MDG Premium, longtime 10X alumnus, and in my 11th year of a small med device design firm. You know, part-time victim for Joe when he just has to make a joke out of somebody. But I mentor in my spare time. I mentor a little group called Career Transition Workshop. One of the mentors. We help people find jobs, play guitar on the weekends, and try to get out on the bike trails just about every day and put in my quick 13 miles. I don't think of myself as really being in love with my work, but I had a friend tell me the other day that when we go from conversing about anything else to conversing about work, my voice takes on a whole different tone. So I realized by default that I really do love what I do. As a medical device designer, there's most of the stuff that I'm working on I can't say anything about. I've got some stuff. I've got an Alzheimer's application, which I still can't really talk about very much, even though it's been in the papers. And but fortunately, I've been designing med devices for a total of 21 years, so there are some neat examples that have come up along the way. And I do have one really embarrassing habit, but well, let's just move along to the #1 reason that your design will fail. First of all, a lot of times somebody will talk to me and they'll say, "Oh, you're an engineer," but legally you have to have a PE behind your name to be an engineer. And I say that because it's super important. Came up with something I was working on, and you will get a call from a regulatory agency who has the power to do all kinds of things to you if you misstate that. You need a PE if you're going to build roads and bridges. And I've never used a medical device for a road or a bridge, so I don't have a PE for professional engineer behind my name, as don't most people in my business. So, so this is me. I hope you can all see this board. Let's see if this works. There we go. And the biggest reason that every design fails that I've seen fail has mostly been us. And by that I mean some of the assumptions that we make when we're putting a design together. I don't know the name of the guy that I'm quoting, but he's an old mathematician. And during a presentation years and years ago, someone told me that this gentleman said his students almost never got a problem wrong because they did their math incorrect. They always when their calculations came up wrong, incorrect, it was usually because of one of the assumptions they'd made early on. And then, of course, they did all their math correctly, and they ended up with the wrong thing. Not as tragic as when NASA mixed up English and metric on the Mars probe, but little assumptions, little things that just cause a real catastrophic mess. But we all have to make assumptions, so we all have to assume a lot of things. We put things into groups and categories, and if we did, we couldn't even think. So a lot of times we'll end up having to really tweak the number of different kinds of things that we assume. And so we're always on guard to make sure that we're assuming enough things to be efficient, but we're not assuming so many things as to basically get over our skis. And so what I'm going to do is I've got a few examples, probably more than I need. So Joe, you can stop me anytime that we've kind of reached a limit or anything like that. But what I'm going to try and do is cherry pick some from some of the different disciplines that everybody's here about. And one that I mentioned before was well, I'll just go down and hit a few on this list. I've got them all. I've got titles for all of them. It's just my way of helping to remember them. I've got one that I call the radius note and the eternal inspection. And what we ended up having was I used to work on, this isn't one of the devices I used to work on, but I used to work on process engineering and later design for all kinds of implantable devices and defibrillators, a power unit for an artificial heart, and little things like this one. And we would do neurostimulators, and we had these really cool aluminum cans. And so we'd have something like this, and we'd have two of them. They fit together like a little clamshell, and it's important that they be inspected for geometry. And when I was doing my first design job, we had a bunch of electrical engineers, and they were designing all of our stuff. And so we had some irregular shaped things, pretty much like you'll always see. And on the drawing, they were dimensioned like this, just the way you think they would be, with some sort of radius and some sort of dimension. Okay, and so we'd have this, and then down here we'd have another radius. And isn't that the way, I started learning to draft in 10th grade, and that's how we learned to do radii. So, and then blends into another one over here. And so the idea would be, the assumption here is that if we specify it, if we write down a requirement, it will be inspectable, and somebody can actually inspect it. And anybody would look at this and go, of course they can inspect it. And of course you might write how deep the can is and things, something to sort of constrain it. And we're looking at things like this. And this goes for so much more than this, but this was such a simple example, I thought I'd throw it in. Well, I went down and we were putting together the optical inspection device for this, and I was talking to the guy who serviced these and knew all the theory behind them. And I told him that we were having, and I found out from our QC people when I was talking to them, and told him that we were having a really hard time inspecting all this area around here. Every time you'd measure it, you'd come up with something different. And again, this is not the brand we were working on, but you'd come up with something, a different number. They couldn't inspect it twice and get the same thing. And the guy who installed these inspection devices looked right back at me and told me, that's because you can't do it. And I said, what in the world do you mean? Because, just look at this. It's the simplest thing in the world. How could you possibly mess it up? And then he explained to me, that the system would not be able to set up. No system could. And no system of measurement known to man could get you the same results in a row. And what the QC department always had to do was they always had to say, well, they seem to fit together, so we're going to have to pass it. They write a deviation on every one of them, and you know how that rolls over in the regulatory area. And keep in mind, we've got this, a real simple example, but we've got lots of other things that run into the same problem. So what QC did do is they sort of shared this with anybody who would listen. And when it comes to manufacturing, listening is a real big deal. Well, not many people did. So we were talking about this, and I realized, of course, that I was even skeptical that this could not be measured. So I looked at this, and sure enough, it was impossible. I said, "Are you sure about this?" And he said, "I'll send you the math." He sent me the math. He was absolutely right. It turns out this is one of the reasons why we have geometric tolerancing. But on the other hand, we had electrical engineers doing mechanical design before I arrived at that place. I was their first mechanical designer. And when we had this going on, I was their mechanical engineer and process engineer. And so when we had this going on, we realized that we needed to change the way we were specifying something. And one of the assumptions that we always make when we're putting together a drawing or specification or electronic specs is we always assume that that just because we write something down, it's inspectable, and just because something is on a drawing, it can be confirmed. And the truth is anything but that. We can run into things. We can also run into things, and I don't have a picture on this, but we can also run into things like SolidWorks or any of your CAD design programs. You know, we produce these beautiful, amazing looking renderings of things, and you know, and supposedly it's very exact, and it is in a sense. But I was working with someone. They were putting together their systems, and they were building their quality systems to reflect all the regulatory requirements that we have. And they were saying, well, this is great. You know, our document of record, and anybody who's into this knows the document of record, that's the thing that the FDA looks at when they come in and audit you. When something goes wrong and they have to start researching you, or God help you, you get a letter, you've got, they're going to come in and start digging through everything. One of the things that, and very often the FDA doesn't exactly know how your device works, but they know how the standards work. And so they'll pop it. They'll be asking you where everything is. And when they dug this up, they would see, well, your document of record is the drawings in SolidWorks. Okay, well, have you validated that program? It's nearly impossible to validate a program like SolidWorks. It's always being updated. It's always being changed. It would cost a fortune. So sometimes the assumption is that observing something, being able to get as close to the source of the design as possible, is the most efficient, most effective, and most transparent way of being able to regulate it and control it and regulate it properly with all of our laws, FDA, CE, the whole 9 yards. What I told them is that they would spend so much time and money futilely trying to take care of that software and actually validate the software, that they were much better taking files that came from that software, using them as the document of record. Again, the assumption is that the closer you get to the source of your data, the better your regulation will be and the better your control. The truth is exactly the opposite in this case. So what we instructed them to do was take these beautiful CAD models and make derivative models of them that are fixed and won't change. For those of us in the business, they're called, most common one is step files, which is abbreviation basically for a dumb solid. You can't change it, but it throws the solid out there. It won't change. The software that you open it with will not change it. Nothing will change. It's extremely stable. And if there's anything wrong with it, you don't have to go back to the SolidWorks software because that is your document of record. And how about the drawings? Well, the drawings are just as susceptible to revision changes and anything else that might happen with your SolidWorks system. And SolidWorks is a great, you know, and there's Solid Edge and various other wonderful little softwares, but being able to confirm that everything is correct in the record-keeping system in those, extremely complex, extremely expensive, extremely prone to problems. And also it doesn't give you anywhere to try things out. So what we told them to do was, what I told them to do was make PDFs, make Adobe files of all of your drawings. They're going to be just as good, and you can use those as your document of record. Therefore, if you ever have scrutiny, the job of confirming what documents are where and what goes to what, connecting all these dots is just a matter of looking at simple files and not complicated things. So sometimes we make a mistake in that, you know, we assume that if we create an additional record, it'll only make things more complicated, when sometimes that assumption is completely the opposite of the fact. By the way, if somebody ends up with a question, I've been told by some people that I am pretty loquacious.
Yes, I have a
so-
question.
Go.
What the fuck are you talking about? All right, let me paraphrase in a more polite business way.
Oh, you don't have to
My
be polite.
short
I'm just
attention span theater, and I'm not a designer. How could I paraphrase the last 10 minutes to something my mother-in-law could understand? Give me 3 sentences.
Don't assume that your instructions will result in what you think that they're going to do. Make sure that the other person can understand them and do whatever the heck they're supposed to do with them. That's the first one. The second one is, don't assume that the way you do it is going to be the way that somebody else can understand it and the way it'll be useful. And don't assume that the simplest method is really the simplest method.
So what you're saying is designing medical devices with a team is like having teenagers.
It is. But teenagers make great football teams. They make great debate teams. They make great craft teams. They do great things. They just have to be run right. They just have to know, where the ball is, what the goal is, and what the rules are.
So is the number one reason my design will fail that I didn't communicate properly with my teammates?
That you made the wrong assumptions. And one of those assumptions is assuming that just because you say something, that those words will be useful to somebody else in the form that you said them.
Right. Well, that's why we play back what people said. I often say, if I understand you, you just said, and then at least half the time the person said, no, what I actually said was, and then we do this and I iterate until they're like, yes, you understand what I said.
And then you can move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Rick, I think that, one of the things that is overlooked a lot in the field, not just in your design, but just in all the different fields of technology is, they talk about people, processes, and technology. And a lot of times, a lot of effort is put into technology and processes, but then they underestimate that the people part of it is probably where the problems are going to happen, and that the communication and the people is where they need to put a lot more effort into making sure that that's happening correctly.
You're absolutely correct. I was dealing with an engineering sales team in India, and they had a real different concept, different cultural concept of what truth was, to the place where I couldn't use that word in a sentence anymore. It's not that they didn't believe in truth. It's just that they thought about it differently than we do. And one of the best rules for communication that I know of is, don't assume that everybody is going to be speaking in exactly the same concepts. And if you find yourself disagreeing with somebody, the other one is, don't assume you're always completely right. Assume that there could be a misunderstanding and that you're incorrect and need to change. And those are great things those are great operating system rules for your brain. And without them, collision is inevitable.
Well, Rick, what I really appreciate about that being the number one design will fail is that, you're a very, very technical person, as came out strong in the start of the call, but that's a very soft skill that a lot of particularly engineering teams are not good at in general. And you can kind of get lost in the way engineers talk.
You
So
can.
I really appreciate that was a soft skill, and that's the number one way that you will fail. And it's like one of the things that engineers are the worst at.
Right, Michelle. I mean, just
go
the
ahead.
nomenclature alone of the communication is difficult. I mean, how many different ways is POC? If you just say POC, you know, it's a proof of concept or point of contact or you know, in that, you know, so little things like that can really start messing things up throughout a process.
Well, Joe is right about feedback. What are the, you know, if you're doing a service for somebody, what are the 3 nightmare calls that you don't ever want to have? Okay, one of them is, that's not what I wanted. You've been working for a month and a half on something that I didn't want. We're going the wrong way. I had no idea it was going to turn out that way. Now I'm pissed and my schedule is screwed up and it's all your fault. Okay, that's one. That's just one of the calls. The second one may be, you know, this isn't done in the time that I thought it would be done. I had no idea that it was going to take this long. Or sometimes, rarely, this is taken way too short. I'm really not ready to assimilate it, and I don't have the money to, you know, take care of this right now because this is way ahead of schedule. I didn't realize it would go this fast. Usually it's the other way. And that kind of leads to the third one, really devastating, is I had no idea that my costs were doing this. And I don't know what my costs are doing for. And so let's add to that Joe's talk about feedback and get something going where you've got information going both ways. So a few years ago, I learned that it was really productive to be able to send my customers a link and say, click this link and you will see where all your costs are. There will be dates, there will be a sentence or two about what's going on, and there will be a cost over in the right-hand column for that, you know, for what we did. You can go right down a list of days, a list of things, and I find out the level of detail they're really comfortable with, and I give them that level of detail. They may want to know every task. They may want to know just a summary for every week. And every customer, I invoice a little bit differently, giving them that level of detail that they're looking for. And about the other thing, about time, you can do the same thing. You can do exactly the same thing with how a project is going and solve it in one sheet. You can give them same thing, a little word online diagram. You've got screen prints with little descriptions and just brief little summaries. Here we are, you know, we just designed this. We've got a conflict here and here, and you can kind of circle it, give them a couple of comments, and you just publish that at the end of every day or at the end of every couple of days. So they can get in there, they can look at it from their darn phone. But the first few years of doing this, I've been doing this for 11 years so far, and the first few years, those were the kind of calls that I would get, and they're all based on assumptions that we're all understanding each other, and we know that doesn't happen. So they have to find some way, you have to find some way to be transparent with them, and you have to make sure that they get it and they understand it. I even tried other computer formats and they wouldn't get through somebody's firewall. So I had to narrow it down to the stuff that would work with them. And then I'd still deal with about 4 different kinds of site sharing. So yeah, absolutely. It's the human stuff. But it translates into dollars, lost time, frustration, and everything else if it's not done right. Well, stop me if I'm moving too fast, but we'll go over to another one. And this little guy right here is 3 inches long. It's a little bitty wrench. It's used in a little medical application, and it's a torque wrench. And it's almost always, this is from a patent drawing, and it's the only patent in the world my name is on. I am not the guy who patents stuff. I make other people's ideas work. That's kind of my little niche. And so I usually don't have to ever totally reinvent anything. That's not my thing. I just find a way to make sure that their stuff really, really works. And that's kind of my niche. Everybody's got their little place, and that's where I usually am. So I got called in one day, and they said, would you, what would we have to pay for you to just kind of tweak up this product a little bit and say, hey, you know what, we've got this, and we know it's great, we're ready to package it, it just needs to be tweaked for manufacturability. So I said, okay, I'll take a look at it. And I said, I began to look at some of the insides of it. There were about half a dozen of them. They were on the desks of every executive. They would play with them regularly. They were kind of interesting to look at. And it's a torque wrench. And basically that means you got a little thing that you're tightening here, and you got a little wrench and you're tightening it down. And you get it so tight, you hear a click. And that means that it's just tight enough and not too tight. And if you keep trying to do it, click, 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 so it won't over tighten it. It won't get whatever it is you're tightening too tight. But it'll make sure that it gets tight enough. And that's pretty much what that kind of torque wrench does. And most of these torque wrenches, they have a lot of parts. Well, this one, this particular one we're looking at would have less parts because it's not adjustable. It's all set. It only does one torque. You know, if you want another torque, you got to make another wrench. That's how you get that into a tiny little package like this. And this thing, the equivalent of it was about $500. And every time you sterilize it, if you own one and you're doing procedures the way they're doing procedures, if you own one of these things, you buy a $500 wrench and then you sterilize it and use it again, sterilize it and use it again. And I won't get into some of the problems that has, but the performance of the wrench degrades because the lubricants don't take the sterilization very well. So then we have this thing, and they want to do this for less dollars. And just sell one, and you use it, and then you throw it away. Makes sense. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but I took a look at it, and the mechanism that they had in place in this guy right here involved such fine features and such fine level of detail that it would be very expensive to make, and then it would also be very, very expensive to make uniformly, because the features were so little and tiny that you'd actually end up having the normal production tolerances that get this big, it'll get this small, actually getting almost as big as the size of your little teeth. And so you could never depend on what it would be like. And I was a little suspect of the mechanism. And I found out much later that the guy who'd brought me in had a lot of suspicions about it too. And so one of the assumptions that we make is just because we see something, we assume that it will actually work because somebody's produced one. So I asked about the tolerances, and I'm saying nothing performs exactly one thing except in theoretical math. If you got a speedometer and it says 60 miles an hour, maybe you're really doing 62, maybe you're really doing 58. Torque wrenches are the same. So is every physical tool. It's gonna be a plus or minus thing. And you want to get that plus or minus down to where it's not going to mess you up. And so I asked him, and I said, so what's your range? What range do we have to perform to? Well, just less than this. And I said, so half of that would be okay? I'm kind of trying to get something. And so I'm getting a lot of blank looks back at me. And then a little later, I said, well, how's your testing gone? And more blank looks. So I came in there, and they were looking for manufacturability. Of course, if they just manufacturability, all that is just, okay, we have this great thing that works, like this mouse. We made one mouse. It really, really works well. So now we want to be able to produce 10,000 of them that also really work well. And so we're looking at, okay, so you assume that this little bad boy really works well. It's a great little mouse. And that one is, but you assume their prototype works. And that's not a great assumption to make. I said, well, could I take one home and test it? And so for all of you who are old enough to have watched MacGyver or have watched the new one, I sort of rigged up a little test, and it didn't work at all. So going into any situation and assuming without documentation that something is where the buyer thinks it should be, probably not a great idea. I know I've got friends of mine who've walked into medical companies, and it was representative. They said, well, we have this level of a documentation and conformance to all the FDA and CE requirements that we have, And they walked in and found out that the people thought they did. They really probably did think they were ready, but they really weren't. And I've got some friends with great stories about assumptions they've had to make walking into something. And so I'll show you the only thing with my name on it. There are two other names on it too. The name of the guy who owns the company, and the name of the guy who said, Rick, you've got to do something about this. And me, who figured that out. And basically I got this whole thing. Realize it won't. I got this whole thing out of that. And that's two moving parts. And I didn't even think it could be done. But I assumed it could be done, and then, well, thought if it could be done, how would it be? But we ended up with something that would, I ended up actually getting to invent something because these really good folks had gotten to this place and assumed that they were really ready to go, but they really weren't. And so one of the assumptions that we make is when we look at a job, when we're talking to a client, or when we're looking at the work product from another department, sometimes we will assume that it's exactly as represented. And out of the best of motives, people don't always know where their product is. So I don't know, I may have over-explained the heck out of that, but any questions at all on that little thing? I'll try and come up with something that's totally different. It's not that much totally different, but I call this one high school computer-aided drafting and grade school physics. And when I was working on this, I had, let's see, I got some room here somewhere. I had somebody come to me with a cleaning device, and it sort of looked like this, and really simplifying the heck out of it. Sort of a little cross section, and this was an injection molded part. This was a part where you'd have a mold and you make this big thick old part with these various walls and things like this. And then they had another part that looked like this, simplifying again. But what it was, it looked more like a milk bottle. It's something we call blow molding. And that is basically where you've got a big container, and then you shoot plastic in it, blow air into it, and it takes up the shape of that container. Anybody who's bought a gallon jug of milk or a half-gallon jug of milk made out of those thin, really thin plastic containers, you've touched that exact thing. And so what they said was, well, okay, what we want to do is to save money, we want to combine these parts. And without getting any more into technical nerddom, we're looking at something which we're looking at the classic thing, looks good on paper, but there really is no way to actually make something like that happen. And the assumption that we make, again, it kind of goes back to one that I see repeated over and over again. The assumption that we make is because we can produce it in computer-aided design and it looks really good there, it can actually be created, it can actually be fabricated at a decent cost and fabricated fast enough and basically mass produced. So a lot of times a series of assumptions like that will get you to a place where you really can't move forward with your product. So, and again, if someone's got a question, just yell something. But so far, none of this stuff has really been because at the level that somebody was, they didn't do, they were being dishonest. Nobody was being dishonest. Nobody was trying to do something wrong. Nobody was trying to create something that was incorrect or pull the wool over somebody's eyes or anything like that. Nothing like that was going on. It's just that they thought they were at a certain place. They thought they they thought they had something because basically it looked good on paper, or as I like to say these days, it looked good in electrons. They thought they had something, but it wasn't. So I'm going to take you into something slightly murkier. We had, and I call this one the design group ultimatum. So we had, so I was working with a company where we had a group based in America, we had a group based in Great Britain, and the British had come up with a prototype of a device which was basically an air cylinder with a spring load. So it'd be like your tire pump, except instead of you having to push, there's a spring inside it pushing out, and it should be able to, and that spring should be able to generate a certain amount of pressure vacuum. And so it's all pretty simple physics. And then they said, okay, American crew, we want you to develop this device because we have got a prototype. We've done this. We know this will work. And I was there working with a couple of other guys, and for months we could not reproduce the results. We just couldn't. And so every week we'd have that conference call. You know how that goes. You got the big screen, everybody is around, and the British group is chewing us out because we couldn't reproduce those results. And we got really desperate. We had me working on prototypes. We had another guy doing and then management decided they were going to fix it. So they said, well, we're going to go over to Great Britain. And they came back with something that I don't even know how to do anymore. They came back with an entire page of calculus. And they said, well, we've done an energy balance equation. It all looked completely technical. I swear, it looked like it was just genius. And then at the other side, there was differential equations, which is like calculus with the guts pulled out inside and going backwards. And I was looking at that and I was going, well, I can't remember what any of that means anymore, but it certainly does look like great mathematical minds were at work. And so that was kind of used to beat us over the head a little bit. And they said, why can't you do this? The math proves that it should work. And so what are the assumptions we're making? In this case, we've had the assumption of assume everybody knows exactly what they're doing and nobody's made an error. And sometimes the error is in maybe their lab guys said, we've done this. Maybe their management guys assumed they'd done something else. I don't know where that came in, but their management ended up chewing us out on a weekly basis. So I'm out of desperation. We had nearly lost hope. And so I was just playing with ideas. And I had some prototypes made and things like that. And I was kind of messing around. I had sort of an empty prototype. It kind of looked like an empty tube. If this was just an empty tube, and it had a little plunger in it, kind of like my tire pump. So I thought, this seems to be working. And of course, you'd push it and the seal would resist you a little bit. You'd pull it out and it would resist you, just like your tire pump. If you're pumping up your tires, that seal has got some friction in there. And so I was doing that and I thought, I wonder how much that's hurting our performance. I'm sure they would have calculated that in. So I found out that our underperformance was exactly equal to that amount of friction. And for those of you who are like, I don't care about physics at all, because most of the world, they really don't. They're doing stuff that I need them to do so that we can continue to do business and eat and things like that and pay our bills. But my part of that is the physics part. And I'm sitting there looking at it and I'm going, wow, I wonder if nobody calculated the effect of friction. Like in physics class, they would say, in this theoretically frictionless environment, and all these kind of things to simplify a problem for us so they could test our ability to use basic principles. And I can say two things. Number one, if you discover like that something's going on, recheck your results, which I did, and they were correct. And the second thing is be really, really careful of how you tell management that. That's the only other advice. But I've got a feeling that at some point in time, management over in Great Britain got the idea that their tech guys had actually created that prototype. And never assume that the communication is going correctly when all of your physical evidence is pointing the other way. I mean, if you've got somebody's fingerprints on that doorknob, that's science, and you've got to figure out why they're there. And so we were finding the fingerprints of a real problem on the prototypes that we were making, and we realized that somebody was misunderstanding, you know, and that's the nicest possible way to look at it, is somebody was kind of misunderstanding somebody somewhere along the line. So one of the assumptions that'll get you is assuming that all of the information has been communicated accurately. And that gets me back to my Indian company. And they were unlike a lot of really great companies. They were representing themselves as having 100 designers over in India. And they really just had 2 guys. And I was going to be doing sales engineering for them. And I said, I cannot sit across the table from an American dude and say we have 100 people in India getting ready to design, when really you're going to hire them if we get this job. Can't we just say that? Can't we just say we have a great labor pool of really well-educated people who will be able to put together your concept, and they're ready to hire, and we can assemble them in a great time? And they said no. And we couldn't agree on, this kind of gets us back, we couldn't agree to what truth was. And we thought, well, so I just started using the word accuracy instead. And I said, I need to communicate very accurate facts. And so you can have a massive collision of tons of assumptions. We mean the same thing by the same word that we say. Everyone is absolutely sure that the communication went really well. It looks good in electrons or on paper, so we can reproduce that in real life. And all the other assumptions. So sometimes it's not just one, sometimes it's just an entire variety of these things, which will pop together and create design disasters, program fails. And they're never ever the result, almost the result of incorrectly done math or even material selection or stuff like that. Very often these things are resulting from the way we communicate and the fact that we don't establish a feedback loop. We don't make sure that we really understand. We assume that because we sent the memo off, that everybody read it the same way and that it meant the same thing to everybody. And that's really the kernel of what I've seen probably in the last 21 years of design and the 15 years of manufacturing and process engineering before that. Now it's time for the uncomfortable silence where I say, does anybody have any comments or anything like that?
Oh, I'll fill the void.
Okay.
Does anyone have any comments? Thank you for laughing, Michelle, even on mute.
I have a question.
Who's speaking?
Jonathan.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hi. Rick, where do you see minimum viable product in the context of how you look at the cycle of development of a design?
And so by minimum viable product, you mean?
I mean, it's a product that works and meets the criteria that has been outlined for the market or for the purpose. It might not hit the cost factor, but it executes what it's supposed to do.
Okay, two ways I look at that. One of them is from all those years of process engineering and manufacturing engineering, when I'm looking at something, whether it's performance, size, specification, I'm not only looking at the tolerances, but I'm also finding I'm looking for cues to the statistical performance within those tolerances, to where I can understand, yes, this meets our requirements, but the QC people would say, you know, is it under statistical control? Am I at the place where 99.9% of all product will absolutely fall within a slightly narrower range of specifications? So our spec is here, but everything will fit in here. So I'm looking at that. I'm actually taking a look at the numbers and what we have. And if someone says, yeah, but we're still not satisfied, I'll take a look at how those requirements were communicated to make sure that everybody, again, to make sure that everybody was talking about the same thing. And then one person wasn't saying, here's our minimum requirement. The other person thought that was, here's the average and we're going to go plus and minus. So that's way one, is I'll look backwards statistically at everything and I'll follow it to its source. Because I get asked that question sometimes in the middle of a program. Someone will come up with that, and they'll come up with a brand new question, something like that. The other thing is, what do I do? What do I do and encourage the people I'm working with to do, or at least put up with me doing, when we run into a situation where something just won't work, or where we don't know if something will work? How do we approach that? How do I approach it? I've had things where, as with that wrench, I've had to come up with something from zero. But also there's lots of things, we all run into them, whether it's how to apply a regulatory constraint to a manufacturing or development situation, how to deal with everything from translation of language to translation of concepts between lab and manufacturing floor. And sometimes we're at the place where we don't even have a prototype that will do all of the things that it must do. And we have to do something new, or we have to take a path that's a bit new. It's not something we've done. And it's not something that maybe anybody's done. So this is what I do in those situations. And this is what I have done in those situations, is I will assume that somebody else has already done it. That's the way I think. And I'll say, someone else has already done this. Somewhere across the world, in Russia or China or India or somewhere, someone's done it. Now I just have to figure out how they did it. That's how I did the wrench. That's how I do impossible stuff. So if I'm looking at a minimum viable product, what I'll do is I'll follow it back to the requirements and make sure that we're in control. And if we can't be in control, we'll either reinvent, or we'll see how can we apply this in a way to where the existing physical properties of performance will still be able to apply the therapy that's needed according to the doctors and people that are establishing the standards. So that's what I'll do. Does that help? I don't know if I painted into all the corners on that, but
yeah, this is Glenn. I'm wondering if part of the question might have different aspects, if it's a medical device or something which is primarily a physical object versus something that may incorporate analytics or IT components. Because one of the things I've seen with the people I work with is that if you're dealing with an information related product, there is a minimal viable product functionality that can be enhanced in version 2.0. If you're dealing with a wrench, I mean, a wrench is a wrench and either it works or it doesn't. But I wonder if part of the question has to do with, if you're doing something that's sort of a hybrid and you have anticipated additional enhancements down the road, at what point do you release something that's functional but not necessarily beautiful? Does everything it has to, but will continue to get better.
Well said. Yeah, there is that kind of combination of God's law and man's law when it comes to hardware and software. But I do think that you're right. There's a path towards getting something out the door and making sure people use it. And there's so much that you learn while people are using it. And at the same time, you know, there's various degrees of severity. Obviously, you don't want to be testing around something that's a life critical component. But I was just trying to understand how you see the MVP kind of context in the world of revising assumptions and or looking at those assumptions and then taking a product from concept to design execution.
Well, I'll give you an example of that. That wrench we were talking about, we were working with a metallurgy, and Joe will know who is working with me because he recommended that metallurgist. I mean, if you can't find an expert, call Joe. He knows everybody. But we had, in an early version, it was being stressed to the point where after a certain number of cycles, that metal was taking on a permanent set, but it's supposed to be a spring. Well, what do you do with a spring that after a period of time is taking on a permanent set? Do you say, no, we got to work another 6 months before we release our product? Is there another path? And the other path for this company was in the instructions for use. They made sure that it was specified as a throwaway component, one-time use, and then they also specified the number of cycles that it could be used for. It was much more than they would need to, but the tendency is still for people to take even, you know, cool tools that should be thrown away and still use them anyway. And so they realized that they had a good window for acceptable risk if they specified, we did the tests and measurements. We determined how much you could use it before it would begin to not perform as specified. And then we picked a range of use way inside that and sold it under those conditions. So they were able to go into production. So if you can't do, if it won't do everything you want it to, you can do things instruction for use. You can do therapeutic changes. You can actually change the way something is used, knowing that it's going to be better, knowing that you're going to be able to improve it, but also dealing with the medical reality that you do want to go into production and you do want people to get the benefit of this thing that you've just created.
Rick, you had said that you had regulatory tidbits. Did I miss those?
Oh, they were so. One of them was in document of record sort of things. One of them was more generalized. I didn't include it, but I'll throw it in. The document of record thing for anybody who's not into that whole section of it, that is the actual, if you get in trouble, if something has to be investigated, if something has to be looked into more deeply by the FDA, that's what they have to look at. So that's a lot of what that was about. But in terms of, but one assumption that you can make, let's say that we have to make some change to a product. We have to add a feature, we have to greatly modify its use or something like that. Something that would be, something that would possibly be a reason for having to resubmit the product for FDA scrutiny, resubmit it, do all kinds of extra verification and validation activities beyond what you would normally think for an adjustment of a part. There's an assumption that performance change equals regulatory burden. So if I'm going to have something and if it's doing this and I want it to do this, then however I achieve that is going to present the exact same regulatory burden. It's got to be revalidated the same. It's got to be verified the same before it's even validated. It's all going to be the same. But the fact is that if you're going to change it by introducing a new material into the part, that's going to be significantly more of a regulatory burden under almost every single condition. If you're going to change it by changing the process by which a part is manufactured, or the process by which things are assembled, if you're going to use a different assembly method, you're going to have many more validation hurdles. You're going to have a lot more work to do before you can present that part for production. And so if you're in the position of having to do, we need to do a design change. The assumption that any design change that gets you the desired performance change is going to present the same regulatory burden is a really, really incorrect assumption. And so if the easiest thing is to, well, we want to do this, and that will totally meet the requirement. And you start looking at it and you go, yeah, that means we're going to have to revalidate half the processes we use to assemble it. We're going to have to revalidate a couple of materials. We're going to have to do more material tests. We're going to have to stick it in the ovens and see what else gases off because we added some new thing to it instead of using the old thing a little differently. Then it's a really good idea to say to your design team, guys and gals, I don't want to be chauvinist, but people, is there any way we can use the same materials and the same assembly processes, but just tweak the tools and tweak the way we do it to go ahead and get the exact same result in terms of performance improvement? So we're going to get better, but instead of doing it by changing all this other stuff and having something totally different, we're going to have pretty much the same thing, but we're just going to adjust it a little bit. We're going to do some design adjustments and have that happen. That may be harder on the designers. That may require more design work, but you'll make your money over. You'll get your savings over 10 times by avoiding having to revalidate everything and possibly even having to resubmit.
Hey, Rick, I just want to make a comment.
Yeah.
So one of the things I run into, and you and I are both on the mechanical side, is the tweaking is where people get into trouble. And so I call it guessing, and we follow the GROG principle, getting rid of guessing. But what I wanted to say is the very first thing that I do when I work with a client on a device like what you're talking about is I ask them to imagine every part comes in perfect. So forget about all the tolerances just for the moment. I say presented, every friction's perfectly nominal, and that's what I call, you have minimal viable product. That's minimal viable engineering. So you figure out how that works, and that's really the design intent. And we help the clients do that, or maybe they know that, maybe they don't. But as soon as they start tweaking and guessing, they end up in a trial and error model that doesn't always converge. Now, if they do the basic, and it's not very expensive to do modeling at just one condition, it's purely nominal. But once you have that, then you can do the what if stuff. Say, what if I change the material? What if I change the dimension? Because you've established your understanding of the basic physics and the simplest possible configuration. So as I said, the client number zero. There's some amount, you just have to decide how much is appropriate to manage risk. But it's so worth the investment to do that. I don't know if that's the kind of conversation you have with your clients too, is that minimal set. I usually use MathCAD to kind of show them the basic physics, or maybe they have it and we help them put it together.
Communicating that to them is a big deal, because very often, you'll say, well, we can do this and we can do this, and then we can also do this, and it'll cost a whole lot more money. And of course, they're going to go, well, we're going to take the one that costs the least amount of money. Well, that's just your part. That's just the thing you do. And so they may save some money with you, and then give themselves all kinds of burdens, not very far down the road. I mean, before you even get to production, when you're designing stuff like this, that's why folks who design medical devices are usually first on the list to be called in by somebody else who wants to do a medical device. We're thinking about, when my guess is, Mike, tell me if I'm wrong after this, but my guess is when you're putting together a medical device, you're thinking about, okay, if everything was perfect, could it work? And so now we're asking the question, could it possibly work? Okay, so if the answer to yes is that, then the answer is, how much could we screw it up and it'll still work great and it'll still do everything the customer requires? How many times can I run over it with a pickup truck and it will still function at 100%? How many times can it be dropped? How sloppy can the machining be? How bad can the materials be? And then we just design inside of that. But that's a big deal. And we're also thinking, what's the regulatory burden going to be for this? We're also thinking, how is it going to be sterilized? Are we designing it with this that can only be sterilized by this method? What if they don't want to gas it? What if they'd rather heat it up?
The first step though is can it work? So, first step is make it work once in a row. It's kind of
Yes.
open. Can you make one actually work? And my biggest client, when I first started working with them, if everything came in perfect, it still didn't work as advertised. And then you get into, like, say, sterilization, storage, and all that stuff where you're degrading the performance.
Oh yeah. Then you got just bad. But I've seen that. That was that wrench when I first got it. They could make it perfect and it would never work.
So guys,
I'd like to take a quick break and introduce our new friend, Skylar. So Skylar, I'm going to unmute you. Well, I'm going to try, or you can unmute you. There you go.
Hey guys.
Now, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so happy to be here, first of all. Thanks for letting me in the group. It's it correlates with what I'm doing. So what my company does is, how most EHRs, digital health interfaces generally suck?
This is well storied.
Yes. So we help design, we help build, transform digital products. Could be an app, could be a digital tool, could be a patient engagement portion of a website using what's called human-centered design. So that the patients, the clients, physicians can visualize health in a fun and interesting way and ultimately help to change behaviors. These are some of the new technologies that are used. Some, you could call it gamification, where it will help to, like a lot of these commercial great applications are using. These are sort of transferring over to the healthcare industry. So
Skylar,
we're
are the terms human-centered and human-focused, human factors, pardon me. Is the concept of human-centered and human factors the same?
Geez, I don't know.
Okay, moving on then. If anyone knows the answer to that, I'm curious, because human factors I've heard often and become quite familiar with. Rigoberto, you know?
Yes, human factors has to do a lot more with the ergonomy design, and human-centered design has to do pretty much with understanding first the user needs of a product. It has to do a lot with industrial design methodologies to bring some idea to a physical product, and it puts the user first instead of the technology first. So in the case of medical devices, you have already figured out all the engineering parts of the mechanism in order to work properly. If you use a user-centered design, you may end up changing all that ideal engineering in order to be more understandable for the user. So when we work with the engineering teams that have a pretty good and pretty well designed, let's say, interior or the functional parts of products, we usually have to convince them or try to evaluate with them to modify certain things in order to be more understandable, easy to use, easy to recognize which button you have to push first, which one you have to push second. And if you see the overall form of the product, to understand right away what is that product designed for. So it has to do pretty much with that. It's a different approach.
It's highly correlated, but thank you for that distinction. Skylar, I interrupted. Please continue.
No, that's fine. So where we fit in is we're a straight up software company. So we're not you know, we're not MEs, mechanical guys at all. We don't, you know, design the product itself. So we are working on all the software inside of a medical device that's regulated. We're HIPAA, you know, compliant shop. We know all those, you know, encrypted technologies and so forth. So essentially, we work with medical device, digital health, healthcare technologies, personalized medicine, basically to try to help with patient engagement struggles. Companies, you know, are starting to look more towards helping to be, you know, helping their product to be found first of all online, and how to get people to use it more. So that's the idea. And so my company, we're htdhealth.com is our website. That's Hotel Tango Delta HTD Health. So essentially, we're a shop, you know, not just any old customers can't just use any shop. You know, you get a lot of software guys calling you up. A lot of these folks, they can't do what we're doing. So we could be a valuable asset to either farm out to or to use as a supplement to your internal teams. That's it.
Fair enough. Thank you. And let me be sure to introduce you to Jeff Gable. I think there may be some overlap, or at a minimum, I would think some good compatibility. He focuses in firmware and embedded software.
Nice. I also saw a website of a member, a doctor. I think his last name is Liam.
Dr. Lang.
Yeah, Lang. And he's got a urinary device. It looks pretty interesting. It looks like he might be all set, but I'd be interested in talking with him. And it looks like you're on. Are you on his site? Did you do an interview with him? Is that you?
It is me.
Very nice.
Yeah, he's a personal friend and a client, and actually recently kind of joined him as VP of marketing for as long as he needs it. It's to me as, okay, the last time I thought there was a sure thing, I lost a lot of money and my wife stopped speaking to me. But as close to a sure thing as there can be, Brent's company will be sold for tens of millions of dollars. And he's at the point now where he's talking with strategics, and it's a matter of the best fit and the most money.
Yeah, it looks like he's first to market with a product that really solves a huge problem. So
it really does. It's the most exciting story I've been able to tell in 9 years of being on my own.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you guys.
We are at the 75-minute mark, which is typically around when people's attention begins to wane. Any closing thoughts from you, Rick, or Ed, if you want to pipe in and have us hear your voice, or anyone else who's still on the call?
Well, I know I can be long-winded as well, but Rick,
did he beat you with long-windedness? Is that what you're about to say? I thought I was long.
What I would boil down all this to is something I learned myself a long time ago. Communication is not what is said, but what is understood.
You mean we could have done Rick's entire presentation in under a minute? Well, man, that would have saved us a lot of time.
and the other thing that I regularly learn this about is the fact that my wife is English, and we don't speak the same language. And all that thing that you were describing about the English, yeah, I've been there both with the English thing, but also with, you know, engineers saying they've done something, and then you try to reproduce it somewhere else, and there's, yeah, it's it's a widespread issue.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, simulation is not the same thing as prototyping.
as luck would have it, just this moment, as you were talking, my glorious designer, Antonio, just showed me the latest update of what we're building for Rick. So I don't know exactly what this is yet. I mean, clearly he put in silly pictures in the meanwhile, but you're seeing it at the same time as my client, what his new website might look like with some work to be done. Oh, look at that.
I think I owe him some pictures.
Yeah,
I think
and you fixed your nose too, it looks like. Yesterday we cut off Rick's nose to spite his face. It's the first time it's ever really happened in life.
Visual plastic surgery.
Yeah, we're gonna need, I haven't checked your LinkedIn lately, but I don't know how many testimonials you have there. He just asked me, are we gonna have testimonials? And I said, you can assume every site I build from now on will have them, no matter what the category. Okay, JRS, Lorem Ipsum. Any closing thoughts from anyone in the peanut gallery? Next week, we have Andre Domino, who's going to talk about bringing CE mark products into the country and a little bit about how we can help do that. And then in 2 weeks' time, I will not be on the call. It'll be Valentine's Day, and I will be loving my family in the United Kingdom. But we will have a call, and Rob Packard will talk about something Packerish, and he'll be your host. And the following week is the 21st, and we'll be flying home from our great trip and our 10X in London, where I'll see about a dozen of you, which is great, including Ed. I'm not sure who'll be your guest host. It could be Packard again, or if any of you have someone you want to recommend. I won't be here to shepherd and guide, and if you don't like the GoToMeeting platform, you might be like, oh, wait till you're back home. So we might take a pass. Maybe you'll get back-to-back Packards, I'm not sure. But I do like to keep the consistency of the 8 o'clock time frame. And I'm gonna ask my European and Australian friends if Joe stayed up until 1 o'clock in the morning so that you could have a call at 9 or 10 a.m. your time is worthwhile, because the attendance tends to be lower. Well, I'm usually pretty tired too. So if it's not in demand and everyone really just likes the flow of knowing that every Friday at the same time we'll have the call, we can do that. It hurts my 2 friends in Israel who observe Shabbat, and this is after dusk, and they can never join us. But if 2% of us have that problem, I might go ahead for the sake of the other 98. If you guys have an opinion, I'll take that.
Well, for me personally, actually, I like this sort of closing out my week. UK wise, it's 4 o'clock, and so those in the continent, it's 5.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand the issue with Israel.
Yeah,
particularly those who are observant.
Okay, so in Germany right now, it's just an hour more, right?
Yeah.
Most of Germany?
Mm-hmm. All of Germany.
I mean, when we get to the summer months, aren't you going to want to go out for a pint around this time?
Right after this, yes.
All right, fair enough. Okay, well, I'll keep that under advisement as well. Assuming nothing else, this is Joe Hage on behalf of, well, Joe Hage, saying see you next week.
Thank you very much.
Rigoberto, I hope to see you on the platform.
Yeah, sure.
Welcome,
Great.
and we can talk more.
See you later.
Thank you, Rick.
You're welcome, sir. Talk to you soon.
Yeah.